welcome to another episode of the Scottish AI Playbook webinar series. We're so excited to have John Fitzgerald here as our speaker today. I'm so looking forward to our conversation, John. But before we start, I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Maggie Ježec. I'm a projects officer at the Scottish AI Alliance, and I'll be your host today. And a bit of housekeeping. As you may have heard already, the webinar is being recorded and will be recorded. We'll share the recording in the next couple of weeks on our socials, so you'll be able to watch it back. We would also like to invite all the participants on today's webinar to post your questions. If you have a question, do use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering your questions at the end of our conversation. And without further ado, let me introduce you to your guest today, John Fitzgerald, the Digital Evolution Manager at the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, SCVO, and also the recently announced charity sector leader in the UK AI 100 list. Congratulations again, John, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
John, before we get into it, can you tell us a little bit more about your work and your team's work at SCVO and what brought you into the conversation around AI?
Of course. Yeah, so I'm part of the digital evolution team at SCVO. We're a small team that provide a range of free advice and support to help the voluntary sector make sense of technology and make it work effectively for them. So that covers quite a wide range of areas, from things like websites and databases and basic digital infrastructure to things like responsible use of AI or adopting digital culture and practice as part of your team management. So we do that through a lot of free training and webinars. We also run a digital checkup service where organizations can get one-to-one support to help them take their next steps. And we also produce quite a lot of in-depth guides. So we've got in-depth guides on using AI responsibly or managing website projects or cybersecurity and things like that.
That's incredibly useful, especially for organizations that are just starting, maybe about, thinking about adopting AI. But actually, I would be really interested if you could provide your insights on where the Scottish charities are in terms of their progress with AI adoption, but also their attitudes towards AI. Is it sort of mostly optimism and hope, or are there concerns, or is it a mixed picture?
I think it's really interesting. So I guess the first thing I'd say is the Scottish charity sector, most organizations are quite small, like micro SMEs. So 77% of charities have a turnover of under 100,000 per year, which really means it's a kind of 1 or 2 person organization. So what that means in terms of digital adoption is you're quite often talking about organizations where there's not one person who's thinking about digital all the time. It's fitting alongside other areas of work and other priorities. Having said that, a quite interesting stat from earlier this year in the UK Charity Digital Skills Report was that Scotland was ahead of other UK regions in terms of awareness and adoption of AI. And I think probably part of that picture is due to organisations like the Scottish AI Alliance, who've done a lot of work in terms of not just narrow awareness about AI, but just giving that general picture and support across a lot of ways. I think one way we've seen the conversation change quite a lot is been talking to charities about AI since probably about April or May 2023. And for quite a while, the conversation was a kind of very high level conversation about what is AI and what capabilities might be there. The conversation we've been having this year has been much more around, we know that people have been using AI in a small scale way. How do we apply some governance to that? How do we make it more strategic? So in a way, the conversation a year ago was more like we're thinking about it. And the conversation now is there is some AI in practice happening, and that's great, but let's try and make sure it's really in line with our values and doing things more effectively.
That's very interesting. I think it reflects what's happening in the private sector as well, where it's all started with shadow AI and everyone sort of trying to do their own thing and use their tools in private life and then in some areas of their professional lives, and then companies sort of catching up and putting this governance in place and making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what's okay and what's maybe not okay and how to manage those risks. Okay, so if we talk about sort of being AI ready and AI readiness in terms of
Mhm.
a third sector organization, charitable organization. What does it actually mean? What do you have to have before you think about adopting AI? Where do you start?
Um, it's a really good question. I was talking to, as part of a piece of research, I was talking to about half a dozen charities in depth over the last couple of weeks. And one charity there I was talking to was talking about they were quite excited about the prospect of AI. They could see some ways it could be helpful, but they recognized they had some quite basic digital building blocks to fix first.
Mm,
And the two pieces for that organization were about fixing their database, where they had a database in place, but they weren't really using it in a very consistent way. And the other piece was around getting all their content well structured and well organized. Because I think very often people think about AI as a kind of shortcut. So you can say, we don't have to do the boring work with data that we don't really enjoy doing. We can sprinkle some AI on it and maybe it will work much better and faster. And I think organizations that are savvy recognize that to get the most out of these tools, that any tool which uses data or digital, you've got to have your content or your data in good shape. And getting your data in good shape can mean things like having um, good organized data sets, or it can mean just being strategic, understanding what questions matter to you, what kind of metrics are you really interested in, how can you ensure good data quality and data governance. So one thing we often end up saying is these are things that were important in a digital realm even 5 or possibly even 10 years ago. They've not really changed that much. And even though AI has kind of captured a lot of headlines, a lot of interest, we do see that organizations that have spent time on the digital basics, you might say they're actually further ahead because they've got a good sense of where their data is, what questions matter to them. If they're thinking about using AI as a layer to help make content available, they've got a good, reliable set of content there in place as well. And I think the other piece I'd say that's a strong theme for us is using any digital or technology well is about understanding what do users really need. So what's going to make a difference if you're helping people in their daily lives, maybe people have got a particular health condition or need help with protecting their rights or something like that. If you've got a really good understanding of what life is like for them, what kind of questions are important to them, how the tools need to work, that will help you make good decisions about which products to adopt and which ways to do them. So I think it really comes back to kind of that contextual awareness is really important, probably more than the technical side, because I think what we're seeing in the current crop of AI tools is there's a fairly low barrier to entry in terms of the technical skills needed.
AI is definitely being marketed as a all-purpose tool, isn't it? For
Yes.
but also a hammer in the search of a nail.
Yes. Yeah.
And I appreciate. I think we also at the Alliance always underline the approach of always start with what the problem is, not the
Yeah.
solution. And AI may be the answer, and it may not be at whatever stage
Yeah.
you are in your organization. But you mentioned we spoke about sort of data and the journey of data maturity in an organization. I
Mhm.
think it's interesting to you mentioned sort of two distinct use cases in terms of how do you process your content and how do you use potentially generative AI, how do you use predictive AI to work with sort of data. We'll talk about data privacy and the fact that it's often data coming from vulnerable individuals.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about which of those use cases, on what types of AI you see being applied, and if you have any sort of good and maybe less good examples that you could share that you see in the wild of
Yeah.
applications.
Yeah. I don't think many charities are using predictive modeling yet. I think that's probably a quite advanced use case. Some bigger charities are definitely doing it for sure. Um, but I think a more common scenario is charities of any size quite often have a lot of qualitative data. So we interact with people we're helping. We maybe get, write-ups of research interviews or notes from people that are doing the frontline work. So charities, a really common picture is there's quite a rich store of qualitative data with a lot of context. And often the challenge charities face is making that available is a quite labor intensive process. So in a kind of concrete example, you might think of caseworker who's very good at keeping notes in a notebook, but the time to kind of then say, right, I'm going to put this onto a system or database, it's quite challenging. the one way that some organizations are experimenting with that is they're doing things like saying, let's do some transcription of a call if it's online, and then review that and maybe generate some key points from it. So it's a kind of a quite sort of non-technical use case, but the advantage it offers is you maybe then got data categorized or available in a way it wasn't before. Obviously, you need to think through the privacy implications, your ability to check the transcript for accuracy and things like that. But that's one. And I do think if we look at the way charities use data, we're quite often kind of in our day-to-day work, we've got that context, we've got that in front of us. But then if we're going to funders and other stakeholders, there's maybe a need to kind of to summarize and categorize that to build a more analytic picture. The other one on the content and expert advice front, so I think a really interesting example of this one is from Citizens Advice in Stockport, Oldham and Manchester. So it's a kind of a region around Manchester. And the challenge they had was uh, their they have an advisor model, then supervisors, and they had a real bottleneck in terms of capacity where supervisors were being asked to sense check advice really, really frequently, but they didn't have quite enough capacity there. So they brought in an AI tool to support the advisor. And what's really interesting about this model was it wasn't the case that the public was directly interacting with AI. It also wasn't the case that advisors were interacting directly with AI. What would happen is if I was an advisor in conversation with you, had a query, I'd send it to a supervisor who would then access the AI, get help in providing a draft answer, review it with their supervisor knowledge and wisdom, and then once they're happy, they'd send it to the advisor. So it was a kind of quite mediated process. But what this allowed was that somebody with quite a bit of experience and knowledge was able to check a draft before it went back to the public. Now, there was a technical reason for that, which was their insurance would only cover human produced advice. So they had to make sure there was a strong degree of assurance and checking there. But they found very positive results because it meant that the person in the advice session could get a much quicker response, which was more effective, but there was still that capacity for a supervisor to review what was being shared. And I think quite a lot of charities are probably going to end up in this situation where there's a kind of hybrid model where there's a lot of bespoke, well-researched content available. And what AI is doing is not generating the content in the first place, but helping to make it more discoverable and more accessible. Because I think often the challenge that particularly small charities face is they're very good at producing the expert insights, but it can be harder to get it out to the public in a user accessible way.
Mm. That's incredibly interesting because, of course, one of the biggest promises of AI is that it's going to be a time saver.
Yes.
And it's easy. It's easy to sort of get into or buy into the promise that you can just
Yeah.
outsource things to AI, but
Yeah.
actually keeping human in the loop, as we all know by now, hopefully,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
absolutely crucial. And it doesn't necessarily mean that AI will make sort of cut time that's required
Yeah.
at the type of the work that people will be doing will be different. But now we're sort of we started touching about on the limitations of those tools. And obviously in the charity sector, a lot of those limitations have an ethical sort of background
Mhm.
and an
Yeah.
ethical concerns around them. And I wanted to spend some time talking about the absolute foundation, I suppose, of charitable work, which is trust.
Mhm. Yes.
Trust from beneficiaries, donors, everyone sort of in the ecosystem. AI is often being sort of criticized fairly for being biased and opaque
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
untrustworthy in many cases. So
Yeah.
how do you implement AI and protect the trust that you've built through your hard work and helping your and serving your beneficiaries? How do you square that circle?
I think that's a really good question because I think one way to think of the charity sector is we're providing social good at a very human scale. So that can often mean it's a very local organization that knows an area in a way that other social sector institutions don't. You maybe have a situation where uh, there'll be, say, health provision from the public sector, but a particular local charity, because it's really approachable and really trusted, has much more interaction with people and much more awareness about their circumstances and context. And I think for me, there's a kind of fundamental challenge there, which is um, AI tools are very effective, but they produce a very kind of average answer. So there'll be a lot of scenarios where an average answer based on a very large data set is probably pretty good, but there'll be other circumstances where that's not okay. And I think the big asset that the charity sector has is we're close to the communities we serve and we're with them for a long time and really understand what's going on in their lives. And very often people that are needing help and support from charities face a lot of challenges and barriers in their lives, and those challenges and barriers will be maybe underrepresented in the kind of average experience. So, if you're, and I remember Shannon Valor made this point really well one time where she talked about your level of vulnerability to AI is quite closely linked to your vulnerability in other respects. So if you're somebody who's marginalized in terms of income, in terms of race, in terms of life experience, that could well be amplified by AI because you're going to be kind of averaged out. And I think that's quite a big challenge where charities need to think about, and it may vary use case to use case. I think, is this a conversation or a scenario where we need to bring all of our human insight and awareness, or is it something where a draft answer that's maybe more average will do the job? And one interesting example that came up, I was talking to a care organization who support people who are caring for relatives. And one need they were interested in was they have an advice line which is open right through the day. But they find people doing caring work often want to access advice late in the evening or maybe even overnight when they have just a chance to kind of check in and get some information. And they were thinking about the fact that that could be a really helpful thing to do if something was available right through the day and night. But then thinking about with a human doing the advice piece, you can work out, right, actually the question you're asking presents some risks. Maybe you've said, what do I do if somebody's fallen over? And there's a need to kind of escalate that and say, well, it's not just a routine piece of advice. We need to help you get some very urgent support. And I think it's quite hard to think about how you would build an AI-based tool that would have that ability to be flexible and aware. So it's an interesting question. And I think on the bias piece, I think one of the challenges is if you think about the data which is going into AI-based tools, it's based on very mainstream data sets. So it's really going to underrepresent people that are more marginalized.
Which makes me think of, very often the tools that the charities have access to, those that are the most affordable tools, are not
Yeah,
bespoke tools built on very sort of transparent data sets and accurate
yeah,
data sets, but it's sort of generally available tools that are coming to us from the US very often, built under very different sort of regimen in terms of regulation.
yeah,
And that in itself carries a lot of risk, I suppose, in terms of, organizations not being entirely able to vet those data sets, to test those systems, not having the time, the capacity, and also it's not their
yeah,
role. But I do
yeah,
wonder how this risk can be mitigated in terms of, applying those tools that are not purpose built but are sort of released, to the world, I suppose, to
yeah.
a context that is where the risks are really high.
Yeah, I think it goes
Um,
back to that. I guess it's this interesting paradox where it's general purpose technology where actually starting it and using it is not a very technical process, but you do need to have the understanding, as you're saying, of, what's underneath, if something is not delivering reliable answers, why is that? And I think, a lot of people have that quite superficial experience where they think, well, oh, look, it said something a bit unusual or that doesn't quite hit the mark. But there needs to then be a thinking through about, well, why did that happen? Was I using it in a way that wasn't appropriate? Is there a way I could link in a data set? So that's one thing that Citizens Advice in Stockport did was they linked their tool to a couple of definitive data sets so they could make sure that that information was coming right at the top of the queue in terms of formulating a response. But that requires a certain technical ability. And I guess, probably the biggest risk, as you've kind of highlighted, is those kind of there by default tools are kind of right on people's radar. So that's going to feel like an easy thing to start off with rather than doing that early work and saying, right, we need to think through what's appropriate for us, what risk levels are we looking at, and what ability do we have to sense check things as well. Um, and I feel like one of the big challenges right now is I've talked about the AI glitter bomb. So it's like if you have a glitter bomb, you get glitter everywhere, even in places where you don't want it.
I love it.
And I think,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
true.
and that's kind of what charities are grappling with now is going back 18 months, you had to go and seek out a kind of standalone AI tool. And now every app that you touch has got some
Mhm.
kind of glitter in it somewhere. And quite often that's not appropriate or useful. So I think there's a piece around charities being able to, and that's probably, you know, a need for good product design. So, in an ideal world, you'd have that sense of, right, can I switch it off? Yes, if I need to. Can I understand what model is being used and how it's working? That would be great, but that's not often there. It's kind of,
Mm.
companies go for the kind of, we'd rather it was just on by default because that helps us monetize our product a bit more. So it's a bit challenging.
Are you aware of any cases where, because definitely from my experience, there is a huge disconnect between the good intentions of the tech sector that wants to obviously sort of,
Yeah,
even the smaller companies are focused on really on the AI for good solutions,
yeah,
and
yeah.
charities that are really on the ground in the communities doing the God's work without the sort of tech solutions necessarily. There's a bit of a disconnect. But do you know of any examples or good practice where that actually worked, where the private organizations, charity organization came together, and maybe potentially even with academia, and actually the delivered solution that worked?
Um, I'm trying to think of specific examples. I mean, one place that's worth going and having a look is a charity called CAST have compiled a library of AI experiments. So what they're doing there is trying to capture in a kind of open working type of way early examples. And one thing that's quite interesting about that is they're not just looking for completely polished case studies, because quite often what happens is there's a lot of experimentation goes on and you report back on the things that work really well. And then you forget the ones that didn't work well. So the idea of
Mm.
the experiment library is it's good and bad together. I mean, one example I think that's worked quite well in Scotland has been Citizens Advice Scotland worked with an organisation called Help First, and it was
Mm.
giving them ways to improve their response time. So one example was their national helpline, where in the pandemic they had to introduce that so that people would start with a phone call rather than going to their local branch because of social distancing. And they used AI to help with voice recognition in the helpline, so you could quickly say, right, I'm based in Portobello, and it would say, right, you're in East Edinburgh, can I connect you to your East Edinburgh branch? That provided a very quick experience for users. It helped reduce the admin workload a lot for citizens' advice. So what I liked about that example was it wasn't about applying AI across the board or applying AI on the kind of most high stakes part of the interaction. It was about an AI kind of affordance. So it basically helped the organization be that little bit more effective. And I think maybe a symptom of the tech for good sector is they sort of imagine they can um, invent a new kind of charity from the ground up.
Mm.
And that's very tempting. You might think, well, we can solve poverty or we can kind of solve some really hard problem that people have been trying to fix for hundreds of years. I think the reality is there's lots of potential for areas where if you made existing charities 20% more capable, you'd see a
Mm.
really massive impact. And there maybe be a flywheel effect as well. So if charity gets more effective, it can do more impact for the same resource, but maybe it frees up a bit of capacity to kind of think of other ideas to go even further. So I think there's maybe a piece around if somebody from the tech sector looks at a charity, they might think, oh, they're not very techy and maybe they're not very effective. I think the answer is charities are very effective and very important, but it's all about adding to that capability and kind of recognizing what's there in the first place and not skipping over it too quickly.
There's definitely this underlying, I suppose, risk of the AI for good
Yeah,
narrative that
yeah,
we turn into techno solutionism and try to basically solve social and political problems with technology.
yeah. And I think a good example, an interesting kind of edge case might be thinking about, say, somebody who's a frontline worker. And we talked about the
Mm,
example of maybe they could get some AI assistants to capture notes more effectively and get more insights. And that feels at the kind of short term, like that could be really beneficial. 'Cause you might
mm,
say then that person's got more time so they can see more people in a given week, which is probably a good thing. There's more insight going into the system, which might mean there's a kind of ability to detect and prevent risks earlier. But I guess the slight worry you might have is if somebody's caseload looked like 20 one-to-one conversations a week, and then you can say, right, you can now do 30, you've then got somebody who is potentially going to get burnt out, and there's maybe no opportunity to reflect. Because, note taking is a chore for sure, but it gives people that chance to reflect and go, well, actually, one thing that we didn't quite talk about in that conversation, but felt very present as an issue is this. And if
mm,
something is coming back to you instantly as a summary, you maybe don't have that kind of opportunity. So I think there's a kind of delicate balance to be walked where there's lots and lots of areas where if you can lighten the workload, particularly in admin related things, you can boost impact. But it's about recognizing that the work needs to be kind of reflective and responsive as well. And I think there's a big risk there where, particularly if you're a policymaker or a funder, you might say, it'd be great to make the charity sector even cheaper. And maybe that's
mm.
the wrong thing to think.
Absolutely. And I think AI note takers or AI scribes are also quite a contentious, I suppose,
Yeah,
use case, and that
yeah,
draws a lot of sort of controversy in terms of how it's being used.
yes,
And I do wonder. We've both attended the Scottish AI Alliance's People's Panel on healthcare,
mm,
where it came up quite a lot. We talked about it,
yeah,
and and it was interesting the discussion around making sure not to exclude people from
yeah,
the process or from healthcare just because they refuse or have concerns about
yeah,
AI.
yeah,
And there's something about, this technology. We talked about it a little bit already in terms of excluding people
yeah,
because of, well, their digital barriers, but also now potentially because of their convictions around AI and concerns about data and all of that.
yes.
How do you feel this could play out, and what risks are there?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenging one. Rachel Caldicott has recently done some small scale research on this and talked about, an issue with AI based transcription is if you don't have a kind of quote normal unquote speech pattern, you
Mm,
could be, unfairly burdened or, you know, find you have a much more difficult experience. And the kind of example people talk about, 10 years ago is the kind of funny example is you're trying to book a ticket in the cinema and it can't detect your voice. Now, obviously, things have moved on a lot since then, but that doesn't mean things are perfect. But I think the parallel I would probably draw as well is around digital exclusion more generally. So there's a big push from the public sector to digitize public services. And, for many, many people, that can offer a more effective experience. Maybe you're getting a text message with a link that really kind of is an easy way to get information or get prompted about something, and that's really helpful. It really fits into our lives. But we have to recognize that not everybody is online, and some of the reasons that people aren't online are maybe fixable reasons that we can respond to. Maybe it's one around resources or training or education, but there will always be an element of that. And I think you have to think quite hard about if something is a universal public service, how are you really making sure that's truly accessible to everyone on an equitable basis? And I think, again, going back to the kind of the smaller scale of charities, I think that can often show up in a really, maybe it's a quite informal way, but if you're just working really closely with the community, you see people as different people and understand their circumstances. So maybe that's something like, well, we know our opening times need to be inclusive to everyone, or we need to think about the way that a service is operating to make sure it really works for everyone in our community. And I think a challenge at a really big public sector scale is you've maybe got big picture drivers about the way you want to deliver a service, and they become quite disconnected from the way
Mhm.
people live their lives. Yeah,
It sounds like there's, and it's obviously sort of not surprising that there are a lot of risks, even if you apply, AI tools on a very small scale.
yeah,
They still carry a lot of risks, and just because they're so easily accessible and so many people use them, it's very often
yeah,
to sort of fall into the impression that those risks are managed elsewhere and someone else is
yeah,
managing them and taking care of them. But I wanted to ask about your view about how can charities actually manage those risks. I know obviously governance, writing a policy,
yeah,
you at SCVO have an AI policy. How, if you could speak to that a little bit,
yeah. Of
managing those
course.
risks and
Yeah,
governance, that would be super helpful.
yeah. I mean, that's definitely probably been one of the most frequently asked questions to us this year. Has been we're developing a policy. How do we do that? And I've talked with a lot of charities where they kind of got a bit bogged down with it. So obviously AI is very new technology. It cuts across lots of areas. So it can be quite hard to think about, well, how big or small does this policy need to be? So what we did at SCVO was we started with a couple of AI in practice groups. So we gathered together people that are using AI in different ways and just had a kind of a safe space to reflect, if you like, where people could just be really open about what they've been trying, if they'd seen any challenges, if they had any questions. And that ability to kind of gather some actual real life, what's going on type insights was really helpful because I think if you'd skipped that stage, then you would probably have missed actually really common use cases that people were grappling with. So we started with that. And then we also got together people who had expertise in data governance and IT, somebody from HR team as well, to make sure we could do a bit of a kind of a sense check to say, right, well, if we start to draft a policy, let's make sure it is covering the right things we'd want to cover, that we normally cover in our policies. And then the final piece was using our existing values. So lots of organizations will probably have statements around their values and behaviors. What way do we want people to work when they're working for us? What's good look like? What does not so good look like? So we use those as a piece of context, and those can seem quite abstract, but actually, once you get down to them, you can connect them with technology. So if you've
Mm.
got a value like about being accessible and approachable, you can make sure that carries through the way that you use technology. And then I think the final thing we did was recognized we're now in a moment where it's better to have AI policy for today that we add to later than trying to make the perfect policy. Because very often when you think about policy or guidance, you think, right, well, this has got to be signed up to right across the organization. So let's spend a lot of time doing lots of research or looking for the perfect answer. Or maybe thinking, right, somebody else out there has got a template that we can use. But actually, our experience was if you do the right reflection internally, it's that contextual expertise that's doing the work in a policy. It's not about having a kind of a really cutting edge understanding of AI, but it's more about knowing really well what's important for your organization, what you need to protect, what you're willing to try out as something new. And so we recognize that that policy is probably going to need an update in a wee while, but we've got it, so it's good enough for now. And so I've written a blog about how we did that because I think there's a lot of organizations who kind of know that they need something,
Mm.
but there's a bit of a worry about how do we get there and wondering how to arrive at a kind of draft they can use.
And there's also obviously in terms of policy, there's no such thing as one size fits all, right? It's all about the
Exactly.
context,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
size of the organization, as you said. I think very often because it's such a new field, we're looking for templates and some best practice and
yes,
whatnot. And actually, I think it's incredibly important what you said, just starting from the knowledge that you already have and the use cases that you
yeah,
already have, and use
yeah.
this.
And I'd probably also say you'll actually probably get more value out of having the conversation. So that kind
Mm.
of share experience together, look at risk areas together,
Mm.
because having those discussions will probably take you further in terms of your learning than writing something down. And the other thing that does is when you do write down guidance or policy, if you've had the conversations, there'll be buy-in for that. Because so often with the kind of policy, we say, right, well, somebody will go away and write it, and it'll look great, and then we'll never look at it again. So there's that piece and kind of having the conversations, which I think can really help throw up insight. And I think that is an interesting thing about AI is I think a lot of people get quite distracted by saying, well, I'll go and find out, what's the latest model release and what the capabilities of that, or what tech stack are people using. And actually, it's just as important to look inward and say, well, what's really important for us in the organization? What are we trying to do in the world? What ways do we want to work? What kind of things are we going to protect in terms of rights and vulnerabilities? And you'll already know that because that's your own context. So bringing that to the table is just as important as the technical side.
I think that it's important. Yes, it's incredibly important to acknowledge that, it's all our whole understanding of AI is also shifting very dynamically. And there's, I think there's no other area that it's where you can see it more than
Yeah.
around the climate and the carbon footprint of AI and how this changes
Yes.
and how we're finding out more and more and the new technologies used in data centers and the scale of data centers and the carbon
Yeah.
footprint of it is obviously incredibly concerning, and also I suppose something that needs to be considered if this is part of your work, if this is something
Yeah.
one of your values is around protecting the climate and protecting Earth.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a bit of a classic example of with environmental questions, like your individual impact or your organizational impact can be quite small. We'd always say digital technology is not usually going to be the biggest source of emissions from you as an individual, as an organization, but it does add up to a drive for bigger and bigger data centers. So if you look at in Scotland, there's an interest in maybe we could have green data centers. But I think if you look at the way planning works, typically now it treats data centers as a kind of small, unremarkable piece of infrastructure. But if you then think about what a hyperscale data center is,
Hmm.
it's really, really big. And that throws up a lot of questions about water use and whether the grid has enough capacity and that kind of thing. And I think that's an example where existing regulation hasn't kept up. And I think
Hmm.
the big worry you'd have is you could end up in a situation where an economic imperative makes people say, right, we do need these things because they'll bring us jobs, investment. And then what you're left with is a big impact on the environment. But the
Hmm.
economic gain is actually quite a temporary thing.
Hmm.
Because that I think is, if you look at the way the AI industry works, it's going to work right across the globe. And if you're trying to buy data center capacity, you probably look for the cheapest option you can get.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of concerns, a lot of ethical concerns, especially to consider. But I wanted us to move to funding because it's obviously also a
Yeah.
huge topic. Um,
Yeah.
Before we move on to and also address the question from Dylan
Hmm.
around
Yeah.
funders, I wanted to ask your thoughts around basically relying on these tools. They're obviously sort of available at a monthly subscription. At least,
Yeah.
also available for free. But if you want to get something out of it, you don't
Yeah.
time yourself out to monthly subscription, potentially building workflows or ways of working that include those tools. How do you how do you marry this with sort of planning for long term when you're relying on grant money? How do you build sort of the planning around that?
Yeah. It's a big challenge. And I think particularly your point about once you kind of weave AI into kind of a
Mhm.
process, you're quite vulnerable. So um, somebody who's quite a kind of prominent commentator on AI for social good, he was a massive evangelist of AI in the 2024-ish, and was like, this is fantastic. Every organization should be doing absolutely loads with it. And he had good examples of how it could be helpful. But then once the subscription models started rolling out, he was kind of horrified and said, well, actually, this could be really, really expensive. So we had to kind of recalibrate some of what he was saying. I mean, some vendors, like a vendor just today or yesterday, I think, announced a kind of non-profit discount of 75% or something like that. I think that's, really good that they're doing that. But I guess the challenge always is that's maybe it's a loss leader to kind of attract nonprofits in. And I
Mm,
think historically in the charity sector, it's been hard to resource technology. So there's not really any dedicated funding for technology projects as such. What charities often have to do is try and build it in. So, if you're writing a funding bid for, um, I don't know, an advice or a training project, it's making sure some IT provision is built into that. And what I'd hope, what we've been encouraging funders to do is if they see those costs coming up, be willing to fund them because
mm,
technology is a really key part of doing service delivery these days. Um, but I think, I would say in general, if I look at where the charity sector is, there's just not spare capacity to do that. So I think in the private sector, you can often say, well, we can see why some investment in technology is going to give us a competitive advantage. So we'll put that money in, we'll maybe get some finance to do it. That's often less available to charities. So it's a bit more challenging. And I think going back to what we were saying about the scale of organizations, when you're operating at quite a small scale, you're often looking at the kind of default provision. It's maybe what's there from Microsoft or Google as a kind of entry level product. And quite often that's useful. I'm not going to knock it, but that then does mean you've maybe not got the kind of flexibility and choice that you might want. And I
mm,
think it'll be interesting to see um, what might be quite nice down the line is kind of products which are kind of offering more of a toolkit or set of choices rather than something which is just there as a kind of you have to use it this way because it's a kind of
mm.
default provision.
And I think this ties nicely with a question from Dylan. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
submitting it. How can funders and sector bodies ensure that AI adoption strengthens fairness and access to funding, rather than embedding bias and widening the gap between large, well-resourced charities and small community groups?
yeah. I think that's a great question, Dylan. And I would share that worry is what can often happen is, there's some ways to boost productivity, but they're not reaching everybody equally. So I first talked with funders about AI in May 2023, and I did a kind of live demo of ChatGPT because that was a moment where you could still do a live demo and impress people. But half through hadn't seen anything like it before, and you could immediately see all the funders saying, "Well, actually, our funding process is based around 4 pages of written text.
Mhm.
That's our kind of starting point where we assess a bid." And they could see that their model for kind of using that as a way to assess which are the best ideas and the most deserving causes is going to be really challenged by that. Now, I think what that has led funders to do in good cases is become really reflective and think about, well, is 4 pages of narrative the right starting point? Are there other ways we could do it? What other funders have done, which I think has been very helpful to the National Lottery, is an example where they put a statement on their website. So they've been upfront and said, we know that some people may use AI tools, and here are some ways we recommend so you can use it more effectively. But I do think there is a scenario cropping up where charities that are well resourced can use AI in a kind of savvy or sophisticated way. So their already quite good funding bids are getting even better, or the number of funding bids they can place are even more. And then charities that are maybe lacking in resource are perhaps only able to use AI in a quite unsophisticated way. And then the quality, that stands out to a funder. Funders have said to me, "Oh, there's definitely some bids where we can just spot that somebody's done a very simplistic use of AI, and that's scored really low in terms of the assessment." So I think the worry is you get this situation where organizations are already a bit further ahead or even further ahead, and other organizations, while maybe perhaps language is less of a barrier, actually being able to use the tool really well is not obvious and not straightforward. So what we're doing is kind of being in dialogue with funders, make sure they're really aware of this risk and thinking about practical ways to mitigate it. I've not seen funders using AI as a decision-making tool, but I have heard of and seen funders using it to help with the writing up. You've got a proposal, you need to write up an assessment and a kind of view on it. And some funders are using AI to help with that. Um, and I think they find it's been okay because there's still staff there, but I guess there's a worry about that might erode staff insight over time because they're spending less time with stuff.
It's
Yeah.
quite easy to envision a scenario where basically it's AI talking to AI. So organizations use
Yeah.
AI to write funding
Yeah.
applications and funders to
Yeah.
evaluate those applications, and there's just
Yeah. I
no
mean, I think
human clarification.
part of what's driving funders is I think they would all like to reduce the burden in grant making. So they'd
Hmm.
like the application process to be easier. They'd like to uh, keep as much resources they can for the actual grants. I don't think any funder would want to be spending lots and lots of money on the assessment process. If they
Hmm.
can find ways to make that lighter touch, most funders recognize almost every applicant is worthy of funding. So in an ideal world, you'd be able to kind of work that out automatically. But I do think there's probably quite a bit of work to do in saying, right, if written applications are no longer a completely reliable indicator of which causes should get funding, what
Hmm.
other approaches can we take? And there's not a kind of a one size fits all answer on that yet.
It's all a bit like reimagining how education can work now in this new
Yeah, yeah. And I
reality.
think, yeah, there's a lot of parallels there, I think.
Um, I wanted to talk about one of the main obstacles that come up very frequently, not just in the charitable sector, but also in the private sector, which is around skills. How
Yes.
do we learn AI? Where do we get the people from if we cannot, if we don't have
Yeah.
the capabilities in-house? How do we bring people over? How do we finance that? What are your thoughts around how to address the skill gap on a shoestring budget or in a way
Yeah.
that is not, because obviously the market is saturated with AI consultants. Everyone knows everything about
Yeah.
AI, but it's very often very generic and surface level
Yeah.
knowledge. So how to upskill in an effective, efficient, effective.
Yeah. Um, I think if I was offering a kind of narrow definition of kind of skill sets that are useful, I think they're probably around product design and product safety. So in a traditional digital domain, that's about, working out what the user needs are to make the best product choices about what's going to be effective. I feel like that's a really important skill set. So it's a relatively non-technical skill set. And it's one I think you could build in alongside other job descriptions. So it's maybe an example where if you can find ways to open up a bit of time and capacity from existing employees, you can kind of build digital awareness into that. A lot of the training that we offer is designed to say, we're not about making you into a coder or a computer scientist or a kind of technical specialist, but it's about we know you're going to be doing a general purpose role in a charity. We're going to give you some digital insight and awareness to help you use that really strategically alongside your other work.
Mhm.
So I guess if I was in a leadership role in a charity, I'd be saying, well, can I help establish a culture of continuous learning amongst my team? But alongside the kind of culture piece, try and open up pockets of time as well. And that's time not just to kind of go and discover what's out there, but maybe time to kind of reflect back together as a team. Because we find the organizations that are making most progress, they're trying out some small stuff and then they're having a conversation internally within the team to work out what's effective. And that
Mm.
helps everybody move forward. So I think that's probably where it's at because I think that for a while everybody got quite fascinated by the idea of prompt engineering. So they said, well,
Mm.
there's going to be this new discipline called prompt engineering, and that's just that's not it's definitely not a professional discipline. I think would be my sorry to any prompt engineers if you're on the call or watching this, but I think it's a kind of fairly learnable skill. So I
Mhm.
think that with new technology, because it's a bit unfamiliar, people often imagine there's more technical learning to be done. And actually, if you look at the way products are developing and the way they're being embedded now, there's not going to be a kind of very technical, narrow skill set. It's more about that general piece about how can I use digital in a really strategic way that lines up with our values. And I think that very often in the charity sector, it's getting people to that threshold where they can say, um, you can now make some really well-informed choices and know what's out there. And that is can be quite a small piece of knowledge, but can be really powerful in terms of its impact.
Um, I'd like to give you a chance to talk a little bit about SCVO, the organization,
Yes.
this type of support that
Yeah.
you're providing and offering.
Yeah.
Before I go there, if there are any outstanding questions from our listeners, feel free to submit it just now. But yes, SCVO, obviously sort of an overseeing body for
Mhm.
the charitable sector in Scotland. Can you tell us a little bit about the training and guidance that you offer, and how can charities get in touch?
Yeah. So we're the membership body for charities in Scotland. We've got about 3,800 organisations who are members. If you're a small organisation with a turnover under 100K, you can join for free. And really what we're about is providing a lot of advice and support to help the sector be the best it possibly can be. And sometimes that's things around legal and policy advice, particularly for organisations that are just getting started. But the team that I run is about digital advice, and really we're all about providing accessible expertise. So helping organizations at that kind of signposting stage. So for example, the digital checkup is one where you can get a free baseline in your digital capability and support to plan your next steps. Or my colleague Maddie runs a really excellent series of training right through the year on a whole range of topics. And we've done quite a few masterclasses on AI. So they've been very popular, and they've been about building your AI awareness, helping you understand the potential and the pitfalls, and then also covering practical examples of what charities can do with it as well. And so really we aim to be a place where you can get really good signposting. So if you go into our website at scvo.scot/digital/support/digital, you can see what we do there. And it's all free to access as well. So hopefully it's quite useful for charities of different sizes.
Amazing. And one final question, super practical, in terms of next steps. So
Hmm.
if if people listening to us are super encouraged by our
Yeah.
conversation and want to go out into the world and actually start looking into adopting AI, what would be the first, let's say, 3 steps that you would recommend them taking?
Um, I'd probably recommend our own guide on AI. So SCVO guide. If you search SCVO guide to AI, you'll find a resource that we first wrote in July 2023, but we've updated quite a bit since then. There's also the Scottish AI Playbook, which is kind of library of lots of resources, that I'm sure people are aware of. There is actually also separately an AI playbook for charities written by an agency in England.
Mm,
And that's not something we produce, but it's really good in terms of practical examples and ideas as well. And I think the other thing I'd probably recommend, it's probably quite a good thing to do across your organization, is something like the Living with AI course. Because quite often what happens with AI is people think, well, I'm not very techy, or I don't really have much hands-on experience with technology. But AI is probably not really for me. But I think something I'd encourage organizations to do is give everybody a chance to build their awareness, because that can
mm,
then mean, maybe you're working in a very frontline role out in the community. AI is probably showing up. The glitter bomb was probably sprinkling some glitter on people anyway. So if you've got some AI awareness, you can kind of help spot what kind of risks or challenges may come up and spot potential. So I think I'd encourage everybody to do something like Living with AI, because it's just a really good kind of building block to start people thinking alongside the more technical stuff.
100%. I also very much recommend living with
Yeah,
AI. Let me
yeah.
okay. I don't see any other questions. So I think that's it for today. But it's so wonderful to speak to you, John. Thank you so much for your insights. It
You're
was
welcome.
such a blast. And thank you everyone for joining. And have a wonderful festive season when it starts.
Thanks very
And
much.
see you next year. Thank you so much, John. Thanks everyone. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.